Li Jade stairs Grievance. On the jade stairs, white dew is born. The night is long, the dew invades her silk stockings. She steps inside and lowers the crystal-strung curtain. Through glittering jewels, she stares at the autumn moon. We continue with the five-word quatrain Yue Fu, and here we have a poem by Li Bai, none other than Li Bai. This poem is, I say this frequently with poems by Li Bai and Du from this anthology, so this is a well-known poem, by which I mean it's well-known by me, meaning I've encountered it in other translations before reading it and finding it in this book. But beyond my own personal subjective experience, I believe this is a rather well-known poem by Li Bai. And the topic of this poem is pretty conventional. If you've listened carefully, you will see that this has a female persona in some sort of palatial compound, pining at night at the absence of a lover who is not coming. He might be an emperor, a prince, or whoever. And the scenario, and implicitly the woman herself, is described as an artifact of beauty. So this is a poem very much in the line of the poetry of the period of disunion of the Six Dynasties, especially the Gungtishi, the palace-style poetry that was especially popular during the Liang dynasty, which is basically the first half until the middle years of the 6th century of our era. This was a poetry that was generally criticized a lot by later Confucian scholars because they considered it frivolous and superficial. In general, you could say that during the period of the Six Dynasties, poetry experienced a positive evolution, although Confucians wouldn't see it like that. So during the Han Dynasty, poetry was mainly defended and analyzed as expressing good political, moral, social intentions and good models. In the period of disunion, once Confucianism lost its grip of the state and the country was divided into different kingdoms, and new religious movements like Taoism and Buddhism started to infiltrate the thoughts of the elite. In that period, a more expressivist view of literature appeared, where literature expressed emotion, and it was seen that literature was mainly about subjective emotions, not necessarily political or moral ones. In fact, the poets of the Janan era at the beginning of the period of disunion are like that, very expressive. And later on, this expressivist poetry also continued evolving, influenced by Taoism. There was a poetry that was very mystical, that was basically the Tao Te Ching or the Chuang Tzu in verse form. And later on, it evolved into a description of nature, into landscape poetry. And the last great poets of the period of disunion are poets which are basically describe nature or describe objects. Now, this trend can seem pretty superficial, thematically or emotionally empty, but the description of objects or nature is never just a description of objects or nature. It generally includes the feelings of the poet exteriorized through an image of nature, and this would become a very typical element of Chinese poetry. It would flourish in the Tang, which, according to some critics, is the poetry that manages to merge very successfully the subjective feelings of the author with the images that are natural images that are used to transmit those feelings, along with undertones or rather overtones meant to expand the imagination of the reader. But anyway, all of this was a long detour to say that even though this poetry might seem frivolous, superficial, this poetry about beautiful ladies and beautiful palaces, it might seem a bit frivolous or superficial or even misogynistic in a certain way. It also is a way of exteriorizing feelings and of describing objects and scenes with great detail. And also remember, these images of abandoned bells, a lot of the time for some poets, act as images, metaphors for the scholar official himself, who is not recognized by the emperor, who is abandoned by the emperor, not employed by him. So you can also even make a political reading of some of these poems, not, I think, in this case, by Li Bai. So, the topic of the poem, as I said, it's a Kuntishi poem, this beautiful lady pining in the palace. in luxurious surroundings, her lover doesn't come. You could say there's also an element of the wakefulness at night trope that comes from at least Han Dynasty poems. The woman, in this case, is unable to sleep. She's probably resentful and sad because her lover is not coming. Okay, so let's go on to the poem couplet by couplet. As I said, this is a famous poem, and beyond my experience, it was one of the Chinese poems that Pound translated, well, more or less, and included in his collection Personae. And at the end of this recording, we will read Pound's version of the poem, which, however genuine or not with respect to the original it might be, is always a good work of art in English, because Pound was a very good English poet. Well, by English I mean in the English language. Okay, let's take a look at this couplet by couplet. First couplet. On the jade stairs, white dew is born. The night is long, the dew invades her silk stockings. So we get this image in the first couplet of these jade stairs. They're not literally jade. I mean, jade is a precious stone, so even in an imperial palace you wouldn't probably be able to make a staircase just of jade. Jade in China, we tend to associate jade with the green color, but I think in traditional China, jade was more often than not associated with a whitish, milky, cloudy type of color. So something like marble. So these jade stairs are probably marble, white, shiny marble staircases. At least they're meant to be seen like that. Not staircases, stairs leading to a pavilion. And on the jade stairs, white dew is born, so, it's night. That should indicate us that it's night, because it's late at night, probably autumn, a cold season. Dew has fallen during the night. And look at the image. It seems as if the dew is born out of the jade stairs, as if it were the sweat of the jade stairs, which is a pretty way of picturing it. The night is long, so the person who is in those stairs spends the night there. The dew invades her silk stockings. So there is a woman. She's outside in the cold, and she's waiting, looking from the stairs to see if her paramour would come. She stays until late at night, so late that the dew infiltrates her clothes, her feet, her silk stockings, and drenches her feet and probably makes her rather cold. Second couplet. She steps inside and lowers the crystal-strung curtain. Through glittering jewels, she stares at the autumn moon. So what does the woman do? Well, she might be in love, but she's pretty commonsensical regardless of that, it seems. She goes inside. She lowers the crystal-strung curtains. One would wonder, though, why would she lower curtains to see out at the moon? And I think, as we will see in Eugene Eoyang's interpretation, the typical crystal curtains that are being referred here were not outside curtains of windows, but rather inner curtains for purely decorative purposes. They didn't protect from the wind or the rain or anything. But anyway, she steps inside, lowers the curtains, and through the glittering jewels, we might imagine the pieces of glass that make the curtain, she stares at the autumn moon. So she's wet, so she goes inside, but she doesn't go to bed. She still remains awake. Perhaps she doesn't even change her stockings, and she keeps looking she looks pining at the moon. She is like the moon in a way. She's beautiful, a beautiful image, but like the moon, she is lonely in her own type of palatial sky. So this would be the straightforward interpretation of the poem, and I think it's the interpretation, the reading of the poem, of course, that this translator accepts. This one is David Lunde. And it's also the interpretation of most Chinese scholars. But I find interesting an article that I've just read by Eugene Eoyang, who is a professor of classical Chinese at the University of Indiana. And he has an article that you can check online in the internet. It's available in PDF, called The Case of the Mistaken Jeweled Staircase. And he makes a very convincing case for an alternative reading of the second part of the poem. So in this version, in the common version, the woman is outside in the stairs first and then goes in and looks at the moon from behind curtains. So he explains that this reading is based on a textual emendation of, I think it's passage, well, two characters that are read in modern Chinese, like Shu Jing, but the original meaning of the characters is something like quintessence of moisture, and it's translated in different in the modern versions as crystal, as glass, crystal curtains. So the interpretation of Youyang is that this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that she is outside, looking at the it's outside, waiting for the lover, in the stairs with wet clothes. It doesn't make sense for her to go inside and look at the moon. It's practical, but you know what Li Bai is presumably painting here is a picture of intense female longing for a lover. So going inside is pretty practical, but it's not excessively poetic. Also, he makes a case that the idea that there could be curtains made of glass on an outside window doesn't make sense. They wouldn't be easy to lift anyway. And well, his case is that if you actually read the characters in a different way, it doesn't make sense to talk about lowering curtains. And the curtain that is being referred to is not an actual curtain, it's a metaphorical curtain. It's probably, you know, a curtain created by the moon, by the moonlight, etc. By the dew that is falling. So that dew that has fallen, that has collected on the steps, that has wetted her silk stockings, that dew seems to form like a curtain of fine mist, and she remains outside, careless of her own health and well-being, with wet clothes, looking through that curtain of fine mist, which is exquisite and jewel-like, and keeps looking at the autumn moon still outside. So this is Professor Youyang's version of the quatrain. On the marble steps. Dew collects on the marble staircase and seeps all night into her silk stockings. Yet still, as a curtain of fine mist falls, exquisite, she looks up at the autumn moon. So, this is an alternative interpretation. I was pretty much convinced by the article. I found it pretty convincing. But I'm not an expert on these topics. So, as I said, to conclude, Ezra Pound's interpretation, which of course takes a lot of liberties with the original. I mean, he was translating from the notes of Ernest Fenollosa, who was a scholar who did know Chinese and Japanese. Pound did not. In fact, for example, curious thing. So first, in the poem, he translates the stairs as jewel stairs. So, you know, that could create a different image, because you might imagine a bejeweled staircase, whereas you're talking about a marble staircase here. He changes the silk of the stockings for gauze. And he even changes in personae the name of the author. So Li Bai, well, he writes it in the Japanese transliteration of that name, which is Rihaku. So it can be even difficult to know when you're reading Pound that the poem that he's writing about is a Li Bai poem. But anyway, his version is the following one. The jewel stairs Grievance. The jeweled steps are already quite white with dew. It is so late that the dew soaks my gauze stockings, and I let down the crystal curtain and watch the moon through the clear autumn.